Before we get started, I would appreciate if you could subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you. Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. So this is part 2 of the video series, Will XRP be utilized in November? And in part 2, I'm going to be talking about what is happening in November in the Eurozone in relation to ISO 20022 and XRP. So I advise you and I recommend you to watch part 1 first, as this video is a continuation from part 1, which lays down the foundation. So you should watch part 1 first, as I'm not going to explain anything that I've already explained in part 1, and to fully appreciate this video you may need to watch part 1 first. So just to re-clarify, this video is not FUD by any way. I am a believer in XRP, XRP's utility, its potential, its price appreciation, and so on. I know that this video may trigger some people out there, and that may be due to your confirmation bias, as the content in this video may not be in line with what you want to be true. So if it triggers you, my advice to you is try to forget about what you want to be true and just look at the actual evidence and facts and don't ignore it. So part 2, the evidence. So here's a YouTube poll that I did, and I asked people, is XRP going to be utilized in November, causing a price increase because of ISO 20022 is going live in the Eurozone, and 68% of you said yes, it will be utilized. So the misconceptions that I want to clear in this video, I want to clear the misconception that the adoption of ISO 20022 messaging standard means DLT-based RTGS systems must also be adopted as well. The second misconception I want to clear is that the Eurozone Blueprint SWIFT document is about settling high-value cross-border payments in real time, which can only be done by using XRP and XLM. And the last misconception I want to clear is in November, they will activate the digital token identifier ISO 24165, which will enable the banks to use crypto if they want to. So let's get started. So firstly, you need to understand what are the two layers involved in bank payments. When banks send payments to each other, there are two layers in that process. The first is the messaging layer, and the second is the settlement layer. Now, the messaging layer, this is the layer where banks usually use SWIFT to send payment messages to each other first, prior to settlement occurring. So banks must have the systems to be able to receive, process, and send messages to each other via SWIFT. So the message usually goes across first. Then after that, it's the settlement layer. So the settlement layer, this is the RTGS system layer that is responsible for settling payments for direct or indirect participants of the RTGS system. So settling payments can be done either using a non-DLT based or a DLT based RTGS system. Currently, banks today use non-DLT based systems to settle cross-border payments, and they do this via correspondent banking. And you have the Central Bank of Europe as an example, and the Central Bank of Europe, the European Central Bank, houses a T2 RTGS system, and it has the settlement layer and it has the messaging layer. So the messaging layer is where the banks can receive, process, and send payment messages to each other via SWIFT, and the current payment message being used today in the messaging layer is the MT standard. Now the settlement layer, this is the T2 RTGS system, which is used for real-time payment settlements between banks that are direct participants of the central bank. Currently, banks that are cross-border can use the T2 RTGS system via correspondent banks that have access to their system. So in November 2022, the ISO 20022 messaging standard is going live. And this upgrade is an upgrade to the messaging layer, where they're going to be changing the MT standard to the MX standard. Hope that makes sense, and I hope it's clear from this diagram what's going to happen. So let's check out some PDF files. In this PDF file is the Bank of England. Now, the Bank of England also has its own RTGS system known as CHAPS, which is going live in 2023, I believe, with ISO 20022 migration. Now, I just want to show you here, even the CHAPS RTGS system from the Central Bank of England uses correspondent banking. In their document, it says, how will ISO 20022 impact you? And they have a part. If you're an indirect member of a payment scheme, in other words, you are not a direct participant to CHAPS, but you are an indirect participant. In other words, you are using chaps through correspondent banking by using another bank that has direct access to chaps. And what they say? Correspondent banks, this is known as correspondent banking, may require your messages to be sent in the new format. So why would they mention correspondent banking if correspondent banking is going to be changed and everyone's going to be using XRP, and correspondent banking is not going to be the way that payments are still going to be settled? Another document, ISO 20022 program, quality data, quality payments. Bearing in mind, what I'm trying to show you with all these documents is that ISO 20022 is about the messaging layer, and it has nothing to do with the RTGS settlement layer for settlement of payments. It's just about messaging. And I'm trying to show you that ISO 20022 is about messaging in relation to correspondent banking, not in relation to XRP, not in relation to blockchain technology. It's in relation to the current system, that how they process high value payments, and that is via using correspondent banks. So it says, what is ISO 20022? So it shows you that ISO 20022 is about, again, messaging, different messaging formats here. It tells you the MT structure, the MX structure. So again, it's about messaging. And it says here, MT to ISO 20022 translation rules, where to find out. So they're going to have a translation system to translate MT to MX, and Swift is going to provide that as a solution. It's showing you translation again between MX and MT, MT and MX, because remember, not all correspondent banks are going to be moving over to MX. Some are still going to be MT. So when the Eurozone moves to MX and the correspondent banks are in MT, then they're going to have two different message systems when it comes to cross-border payments, and the solution is going to be a translation system. So why ISO 20022? It talks about that 80% of global high-value payment volumes will adopt ISO 20022 by 2025. So the new language of payments, again, it talks about the different language of payments, and it shows you the MT and the ISO messaging. Nothing to do with RTGS settlement, just to do with the ISO 20022 and the different messaging. So what is changing? If you look at this diagram here, it looks like a diagram that is showing nothing but correspondent banks. Like you have the debtor agent, the instructing agent, the instructed agent, the creditor agent. And these banks in the middle are correspondent banks. Again, it shows you here the messaging between different banks, the MT messages, MT messages, MT messages. Why do you have, for example, Bank A wants to send payment to Bank D? Why do you have Bank B and Bank C in the middle? Because these are correspondent banks. If XRP is going to be used, there would be no Bank B and Bank C in the middle. It would be a direct connection between Bank A and Bank D. And what are they showing you? They're showing you the messaging system today, MT, and then they're showing you what is going to happen once they move over to ISO 20022. So as you can see from these diagrams, if you understand what's going on here, is that the only thing that is changing is the messaging. Just the messaging, you can see moving from MT to ISO 20022, the MX format. And the banking correspondent banks are still there, but the messaging is changing between them, because the messaging is an upgrade. It does improve the system, but everything else is still the same. The correspondent banking is still the same. So again, it shows you more correspondent banks. I mean, this is just full of correspondent banks. And then here in this document, we have the Deutsche Bank, corporate bank, and they have released guidance to ISO 20022 migration. And let's look at what the Deutsche Bank has to say. So in this document by the Deutsche Bank, it has a section called Correspondent Banking Space, Swift Requirements. I mean, I'm not going to read it. There's no point in reading it. The whole point I'm trying to show you here is that correspondent banking is going to be used in November still. If XRP is going to be used, then there will be no need for correspondent banking, but they're going to settle payments via correspondent banking. I can repeat this over and over and over again, because everywhere I look, all I see is correspondent banking. And it says here, this means that cross-border payments and cash reporting messages using Swift MT category 1, 2, and 9 messages will continue to be used beyond November 2022. After this date, there will be a coexistence phase where ISO 20022 and MT messages will exist in parallel. Furthermore, ISO 20022 will be supported by both traditional XML message formats and API. At this point, however, the MT standard would be supported for backward compatibility purpose. So there's going to be a phase between November 2022 to 2025 where they're going to be able to translate between the two messages, and that's known as the coexistence phase. And this is in line with cross-border payments and correspondent banks. It has nothing to do with XRP, has nothing to do with RTGS, it's all to do with correspondent banks. And all the diagrams they show you is all showing that correspondent banks are going to be used. Now, in that same document, this Deutsche Bank PDF talking about ISO 20022 migration, they have a section that says interoperability between messaging formats during coexistence period. A coexistence period is scheduled from November 2022 to November 2025 in the correspondent, oh my god, banking space. Guys, I'm sorry, man, but it's actually making my throat sore because they keep telling you over and over again, correspondent banking space, correspondent banking space, correspondent banking space, meaning interoperability with MT messages will be required. And exactly what I'm trying to tell you is there's going to be a translation phase between these November 2022 to 2025, and there's going to be interoperability between MT and MX messages. And they're mentioning it in this document, and it's in regards to correspondent banks. So hopefully, I'm hoping by now that I've showed you enough information that you all understand that ISO 20022 is about messaging. It has nothing to do with the settlement layer, which is the RTGS system being changed or modified. It's to do with the messaging layer in line with the RTGS system, but the messaging layer. The RTGS system is going to recognize ISO 20022, which is the messaging layer. And this is in line with correspondent banking. In other words, the settlement layer is still going to be using correspondent banking to process cross-border payments. And the only thing that's going to change in all this is the messages is going to move from from MT to MX. And correspondent banks are still going to be used. They're not using XRP in November, because if XRP was going to be used to process high value payments and not correspondent banks via the Target 2 RTGS system, then they won't keep mentioning correspondent banking all throughout these documents. They won't keep showing us diagrams of correspondent banks, would they? Because there will be no need for correspondent banks if Ripple is going to be the service that the Eurozone is going to use to process high value cross-border payments. So I hope I've made this clear for you. So where is the unintentional misinformation stemming from that is causing people to believe XRP will be utilized in November to settle high value cross-border payments? Now, this information is stemming from this blueprint document, which is the document that is being misconstrued by some people in the XRP community to mean XRP is being utilized in the Eurozone for high value cross-border payments starting in November. Now, let's go through the document and see whether it states or implies that at all. So now I want to talk about this blueprint ISO 20022 for Eurozone high value payments with cross-border leg. And this is where most of the confusion has come from, where people are saying this means XRP is going to be used to process high value payments cross-border. But before I go actually into this document and show you what this document is actually all about, let's just do some background research. So first, let's just quickly talk about what is Target 2. So Target 2 is the real-time gross settlement system, and it's owned by the European system, the Euro system. Central banks and commercial banks can submit payment orders in Euro to Target 2. And this is all from the European Central Bank, by the way. So it's one of the largest RTGS systems in the world. More than 1,000 banks use Target 2. And remember, I was talking about the direct participants. So it has a direct participant network of 1,000 banks, more than 1,000 banks. And here it says, Target 2 replaced the first generation RTGS for the Euro. Target 2 commenced. The Target 2 replaced the first one, and that was Target. So Target was the first RTGS system, which was replaced by Target 2, and Target 2 is going to be upgraded to T2 in November 2022. So Target commenced operation on the 4th of January 1999, a few days after the launch of the Euro. So they've had a RTGS system in Europe since 1999. This is Wikipedia And Wikipedia is like the most basic way to do research, to be honest. Everyone goes to Wikipedia. Let's see what Wikipedia has to say. The use of Target 2 is mandatory for the settlement of any Euro operations involving the Euro system. Yeah, it says here in 2012, Target 2 had 999 direct participants. We know it has over 1,000 today. 3,386 indirect participants and 13,313 correspondents. You see, it probably has more correspondent banks today. And this system is not changing. They're going to be using correspondent banks still coming November. So here it says Target 2, a global hub for processing payments in Euro. So let's scroll down a little bit. It talks about the origin and intermediaries of payments from non-EU countries. Non-EU countries that are using Target 2 like United States, China, Canada, Japan. And how are they doing it? They're doing it through correspondent banks, basically. And overall, Germany plays the most important role as an intermediary. An intermediary is a correspondent bank between Target 2 and the rest of the world. 69.32% of the value and 63.04% of the volume of euro payments originating from non-Target 2 countries pass through banks that hold a Target 2 account with the Deutsche Bank. So Germany is a major intermediary. This is the map below shows that Target 2 connects virtually to any point of the world. Look at this map. The Target 2 system here is in Europe here, and it's showing you that it goes into America, it goes into Russia, it goes into China. Basically, it goes everywhere in the world. Now, how are they doing this and they're not using XRP? They're doing it through correspondent banking. And that's how they're still going to be doing it coming November. This is what people need to understand. The map below shows that Target 2 connects virtually to any point of the world map, with the strongest links outside Europe being with institutions from North America, Asia, and Oceania, however you say that word. In most cases, the financial institutions which act as correspondent banks to Target 2 are banking groups operating in Europe, but with global reach, offering clients the possibility to settle payment transactions in euro as a key aspect of their business model. And this is from the European Central Bank actual website. They're telling you that Target 2, their RTGS system, is using correspondent banking to settle cross-border payments. And the ISO 20022 messaging is the messaging layer, and it's going to be just to modify the messages, to improve and enhance the messages, as I've already shown you in the ISO documents. And the RTGS system is still going to be using correspondent banking. It's not moving over to a DOT-based RTGS system that is leveraging a neutral bridge asset, because if it was, there would be no need for correspondent banks, would there be? Now, let's talk about this document. What's the history behind this actual document? So here we're going to talk about it. The ECB steps in over SWIFT's ISO 20022 migration delay. So I'm going to give you a brief summary. What happened basically is that the central bank was supposed to migrate to ISO 20022 in November 2021, and SWIFT was also going to migrate to ISO 20022 in November 2021. But what happened because of worldly affairs, it caused a delay in SWIFT's migration, and SWIFT decided to postpone its migration to November 2022. When SWIFT did that, it basically impacted the European Central Bank. So what they did is they sent a letter to SWIFT. So letters obtained by Finextra show an exchange by the ECB and SWIFT regarding the latter's responsibility, SWIFT's responsibility to mitigate risks caused by its decision to delay migration to ISO 20022. So they sent letters to SWIFT, and they demanded SWIFT basically to produce this document for them. And as I'm going to show you here, the ECB also requires that SWIFT publish a blueprint no later than early May 2020 in order for European banks to adapt their plans, and SWIFT is to share the blueprint draft with the ECB in advance. So the non-exhaustive list of mitigating measures that SWIFT must undertake are as follows. It has to offer free translation software for cross-border payments which have to be mapped from ISO 20022 to MT. And that's what the ECB demanded of SWIFT. And here it just says that SWIFT publishes a blueprint to assist the EU banks in ISO 20022 transition. So this is why this blueprint came about. This blueprint came about because it was always about the messaging standard ISO 20022 and how it's going to affect banks, because some banks are going to be on the MX standard and other banks are going to be on the MT standard. And this is because of Swift's delay. So ECB wanted this blueprint to be made for them, and they wanted Swift to basically mitigate some of the problems that they will be having with this MT and MX difference between different banks that are using their service. So this document was prepared by Swift, and as you can see, this whole document, if you were to look at it, we're just going to look at the diagrams. It is all to do with the messaging layer, and that is it. It says here, target to MX can be translated to MT. It's just showing you different ways that the high value payments with cross-border leg is going to have ISO 20022 messaging, and how that messaging is going to be translated via Swift. So here you have the target to the RTGS system, they're going to be using MX, but then you may have an outside bank using MT, and then Swift is going to provide the translation service. And that's what it's talking about. It's just providing you different diagrams showing you this translation service between MX to MT. Here it's showing you more examples. MX outside is MT, the correspondent bank's MT. It has nothing to do with the RTGS system being changed. When you see cross-border leg, what is it referring to? Correspondent banks. When you see high value payments, what is it referring to? The RTGS Target 2 system, and it's to do with the translation of ISO 20022 to MT for the Euro RTGS system Target 2 with correspondent banks. That's how you that's exactly what that means. I just basically translate it for you guys. And then what are they showing you? A translation service here. ISO 20022, the message can be translated over from MT to ISO 20022. The ISO 20022 message can be translated back to MT. So it's an MT to MX translation service. And this whole document is just basically showing you MT messages being translated to MX and MX messages being translated back into MT over and over again. Look at this. MT to MX when they're in the target 2 area in Europe, and then when they're going cross-border again, back to MT. And this is what this document is about. It has nothing to do with XRP being used in the Eurozone. It has nothing to do with high-value payments, which people say refers to meaning XRP, being used to process cross-border transactions via XRP and Ripple. That's not what it means. It simply means exactly as I stated, ISO 20022 for Eurozone, RTGS, which is a Target 2 system with correspondent banks. That's how you translate it. Cross-border leg here. What's the cross-border leg? How are they processing cross-border payments at correspondent banks? What's the high-value payment system? It's the Target 2. And what is it about? It's about the messaging layer, ISO 20022. And it's basically about converting MT to MX and back MX to MT during this transition phase to help the European Central Bank with their correspondent banks, because the correspondent banks are going to not be on the MX standard and the Eurozone is. So they're going to have a problem. Swift is going to have to provide a solution to that problem, and Swift is providing a translation service. And every single diagram in this document is showing you translation of messages. So I hope it's clear, and I've clarified that, and it all makes sense now. So to summarize what is happening in November in the Eurozone, the only thing that is happening in November in the Eurozone is a transition in messaging standards from MT to MX ISO 20022. The RTGS systems are not transitioning and will still be Target 2 or T2, and the methods used for settlement is not transitioning and will still be done by RTGS/HVPS systems working with correspondent banks. Ripple is not necessarily going to be utilized in November as an RTGS system, nor is XRP for a settlement mechanism. It's nice to have wishful thinking, but there is literally no evidence to indicate they are flipping the switch on XRP in November, and that they are not going to use their already established correspondent banking infrastructure for settlement. All the documentation indicates that the only thing changing in November is the messaging standard, which would enhance correspondent banking cross-border payments between banks. People may not actually realize this, but ISO 20022 actually enhances cross-border payments via correspondent banks for the banking world, as I will show you in this diagram here. So here is a diagram with the legacy system, that is what we're using today, and it uses the MT messaging standard. And at the bottom we have the new system, which is going to take place in November, which is the ISO 20022 MX messaging standard. Now both systems are going to be using correspondent banks in the middle, but there is going to be an improvement in this system. So with the FinMT messaging standard, you have different message formats and standards between the banking systems. The messages may need translating by each bank system when received, and as a result, it causes slow processing time and there's too much friction. So the MT message when received by each bank may need to be translated by the bank before being sent. And this is as a result of different messaging formats and standards between the banking systems. There is no global standard what we're doing today, so that it causes a slow processing time and too much friction when sending cross-border payments via correspondent banks. Now with the new system, ISO 20022, if you just look at the diagram, I tried to show the difference where with the MT system, each bank has to send out a MT message, whereas with the ISO 20022, it's more smooth. The message can just pass through the banks with ease, because the ISO 20022 standard is an international message standard between banks worldwide. So all the bank systems would recognize the message format. Unlike the MT standard, where the banks don't recognize the message format and they may have to translate it so that it fits in with their format. Whereas with the ISO 20022 standard, all the banks would be on the same page, recognizing the same format. So it causes faster processing time, there's more harmony, and there's less friction. As a result, there's cheaper payments. So with both systems, liquidity would still be tied up because they are using nostro-vostro accounts still. And that's what you can see with correspondent banking. They're still using nostro-vostro accounts, so the liquidity and capital used for instant settlement via the RTGS payment systems is tied up in nostro-vostro accounts. And that's how the RTGS system is going to be used to settle payments, through pre-funded liquidity that's tied up in nostro-vostro accounts, and they'll just debit and credit accounts accordingly based upon the message. But with the MT standard, the legacy system that we have today, there's lots of friction with the messaging layer. Whereas with the ISO 20022 standard, the messaging layer removes that friction, and as a result of removing that friction, it causes faster processing times, more harmony, and cheaper payments. So it is an upgrade to our payment system, believe it or not. It's an upgrade to our payment system on the messaging layer, but not on the settlement layer. The settlement layer is staying the same, which is the correspondent banking layer, but the messaging layer is being improved drastically. So let's talk about the digital token identifier. What is the digital token identifier, DTI? So someone said in the comments in my previous video that in November, the digital token identifier, which is ISO 24165, will be activated, which will enable banks to use crypto if they want to. Now, to actually give the digital token identifier justice, I would probably have to do a whole video on it alone. However, I would like to say that the digital token identifier is a good sign for crypto overall. It's going to be a part of the new digital financial system. To briefly explain what DTI is, DTI ISO 24165 is a new standard to give each crypto its unique identifier code, which is registered on the DTI registry. So by having a standard to uniquely identify crypto tokens to distinguish them from each other would make it easier for financial institutions to use crypto, and it would be safer for them too. This way it removes any unambiguity between the crypto tokens, because today a crypto can have different tickers without there being a standard. For example, on some exchanges, the ticker for Bitcoin is BTC. On other exchanges, the ticker is XBT. And people can just use any ticker they like for a cryptocurrency because there is no standard, and it could vary between different exchanges. So having a digital unique identifier code standard for tokens is more appropriate and more suitable for serious financial institutions when using crypto. So I do see DTI playing a role in the new digital financial system where crypto is going to be a part of, and I do see DTI being used. However, is the digital token identifier going live in November as the person claimed? I'm just going to have to ask you guys, like, seriously, why is there such an obsession with the XRP community space and November? To the extent now people are desperate to throw anything out there hoping something sticks. There is literally no evidence at all that I could find stating the DTI will be used in November. It doesn't exist as far as I can see. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying DTI won't be a part of the messaging layer one day for bank payment messages, which would then use a DOT-based RTGS system to settle the crypto token payment. That is very likely going to happen. However, there is no evidence I could find it is happening in November this year. Lastly, I would just like to add that I did not see anything realistically occurring in November apart from ISO 20022 going live in the messaging layer. That in of itself is a major transition for banking infrastructure, and they want that to go all smoothly. At this stage, they are not focusing on DTI. They are not focusing on changing their RTGS system. They're not focusing on removing correspondent banking. They're not focusing on going full adoption into XRP just to make it happen for everyone in November. So to conclude, there are two possible case scenarios for November: the hopium or realistic case scenario. Now, the hopium case scenario is everything that I have said is wrong, and it has no foundation at all. November comes and I end up looking like a complete muppet as XRP is utilized in the Eurozone, going up to hundreds of pounds in value, making many of you multi-millionaires. Hopefully by then, you would all be so elated that none of this even matters anymore. The realistic case scenario is everything I said turns out to be right, and November comes and XRP is not utilized in the Eurozone and the price does not go into the hundreds, making you all rich. Some FUD is spread about XRP as people expect it to be rich based on misinformation but aren't. There is some confusion out there and doubt that would need to be clarified, and many questions that would need answering. But on the bright side, you may still have more time to accumulate more XRP at relatively lower prices before utility actually kicks in and the switch is eventually flipped. So stay tuned for part 3 and the final part of this video series where I talk about personally what I think or when I think XRP will be utilized and adopted. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe and hit the bell notification icon so as to not miss my next video.